Hello and welcome to another episode of Chai, Children of Adam and Eve on QF Radio 91.7 FM. A special dialogue program brought to you by Adil Khan of Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue during the month of Ramadan, where we discuss research relevant to our lives today. And today in the studio we have with us Professor Harry Verhoeven, who teaches international relations at Georgetown University, Qatar. He specializes in all things Africa, and his remarkable book is a testament to his interests. Published by Cambridge University Press. Please have a look at online if you can. Purchase it. It's called Water, Civilization and Power in Sudan. We welcome you to our studio, Professor Harry.
Thank you very much, Adil.
We thought it would be nice to have a conversation with you about the themes discussed in your book. For example, we begin with a question: how has Africa changed China?
Well, it's a very important and interesting question because very often the assumption is that it's merely Africa which has been changing because of China. I think we're all very familiar with these images of multi-billion-dollar Chinese investments, particularly in petroleum, in minerals, in extractive industries. But what's less known is actually the effect that the African experience has had on China. And there's one particular example that I think is worth starting with. Very recently, a year or two ago, the Chinese main broadcast, the CCTV, opened a huge new building in Nairobi, hiring more than 200 journalists, both from the Chinese mainland as well as from across Africa. Now, the very fact that high-flying Chinese media professionals have to work together with African colleagues in Africa in a very competitive market covering highly controversial issues like elections, like conflicts, like controversial investments in different parts of the continent, means that many of these Chinese media professionals, when they return to the mainland, have an experience that is almost entirely different than the experience they will have had in Beijing or Shanghai. And in that sense, it's the everyday lived experiences of Chinese professionals, be they journalists or be they businessmen, and the fact that in Africa they encounter a very different reality than in China, that allows them to bring ideas back home, which may well prove in the long run to be very difficult for the Chinese Communist Party to handle. So, for example, the fact that these journalists operate in an environment of far greater media freedom, that they are forced to cover elections and conflicts in a way that is resoundingly different from the way they would be covering it from, say, Beijing or Shanghai, I think in the long term points to a very significant process of change from the bottom up. And I think that that's something that we should be focusing on more.
But haven't Chinese intellectuals, scholars, students been trained in the UK and the US and France, I believe, for many decades now? Isn't that experience also significant? Why does that necessarily have to be the African working experience which will bring about this supposed change in the future?
Well, it's not entirely different. Of course, the fact that so many Chinese students, by some estimates almost 500,000, study abroad in the West, in Europe or in the United States, is in and of itself an important source of change. However, the very fact that they are in the West, which is still in the minds of many Chinese is the other, represents an entirely different experience than in Africa. There's still very much in the Chinese discourse this discourse of China as a developing country and, of course, Africa as a developing continent. And so the fact that they are encountering them in this some kind of politically neutral ground in which they don't necessarily have to prove themselves or have to justify China or have to explain themselves, but actually learn and experience things themselves that they might find to be in contradiction with what they were taught, without there necessarily being a Western lecturer raising his and wagging his finger saying, this is the way you do it, that is the way you do it. I think that's a far more powerful way of experiencing and coming to conclusions. So in that sense, I think that the experience in Africa will be more like those in Latin America, or perhaps other impoverished parts of Asia, than it will be for the experience that Chinese expatriates, be they workers or students, have had in the West.
What about the Chinese diaspora, which is spread in every country in the world?
Well, here too, it's very, very interesting that the Chinese diaspora, say in Southeast Asia, has been there for many centuries. The one in Africa is far more recent. It's really a story of the last 20 years, when more than 1 million, by some accounts almost 2 million, Chinese workers and businessmen and diplomats have moved to Africa. The fact that they're arriving anew, and that they're therefore creating the very tracks, not just walking in the tracks that their predecessors laid, but they're having to build communities from scratch. They're having to integrate in cities that are growing at extremely rapid speeds. I'm thinking here of Luanda or Kinshasa or Addis Ababa or Nairobi. That is an entirely different experience than joining established communities in places like Singapore or Kuala Lumpur. And there too, I think there's a lot of excitement for lots of Chinese migrants. I mean, for many of them, this is a first. They really feel that pioneering spirit and all the libertarian ideas that often come with the pioneering spirit. So again, in that sense, I think it is a qualitatively different experience that many of these people, predominantly men, it's important to point that out, 70% of men, are having on the African continent.
Do you have a similar narrative to tell us about African-Middle East relations?
No, African-Middle East relations are a bit of a different story, exactly because that relationship is so much older, so much deeper, and therefore there's far more ground has already been covered in terms of coexistence and cooperation, but also, of course, in terms of conflict and tension. And I think in many ways we're really at a critical juncture at this moment in time when such large swathes of the Middle East are aflame with sectarian tensions and winds of confrontation blowing very powerfully. The question is, will that be the kind of engagement large swathes of the Middle East have with Africa as well? Or do Middle Eastern states find a way of somehow insulating their engagement with Africa from one of these domestic problems that are consuming so many of the states here today? And in that sense, I think the presence here of myself and a number of colleagues working on Africa, but working in the Middle East, is very, very interesting. Because despite this historical familiarity of many centuries, economic, social, political. In many ways, many of Middle Eastern investors or politicians, when they actually travel to Africa, are surprisingly out of their depth. And this creates really a gap in understanding and makes Africa, or many Africans, surprisingly negatively disposed towards the Middle East. And this is why I'm referring to this crossroads. This is really a moment to stand back and reflect on what kind of economic and social and political engagement Middle Eastern actors can and should have with Africa. In many ways, it's a natural alliance. It isn't living up to its potential at the moment. So the question is, in the future, how can we move to a more mutually beneficial, mutually productive engagement between those two parts of the world, who know each other very well in some respects, but as I said, in the other hand, there does seem to be that gap in understanding. And the question is how we can bridge that.
So has the Middle East been changed by Africa?
Yeah, historically it most certainly has. We know, of course, that the development of the three monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, has been closely tied up with African history and the great country of Ethiopia in particular. We know, of course, that the Indian Ocean slave trade in many ways was absolutely vital to the Arabian Peninsula and economic functioning. We've known that for many decades, of course, fishermen from this part of the world have gone to the African coast shorelines and returned with pearls, or indeed with fish. So in many ways, Africa's already had a huge impact on the development of this area. Where it will be even more crucial in the future is in two regards. One question is a question of migration and mobility, particularly as Europe closes down further. The question is, what will the Middle East do? Will it engage in a different way with Africa than Europe or not? And the second one, of course, is the other way around, is the question of Middle East investment, particularly in agriculture and in water in Africa. We know that food security, water security are major concerns all across the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East more broadly. We also know that Africa still has quite substantial amounts of arable land on which productivity has historically been very low. Disappointing hopes that African countries could have an agricultural revolution. In many ways, there is a logical match between Middle Eastern capital and African land and African natural resources. But of course, getting that balance right and making sure that this is not just a question of Middle Eastern countries, so to speak, growing food in Africa and then taking it out and leaving only crumbs for the locals. That's not the kind of engagement Africans want, or I think for that matter, Middle Easterners want. So to have a kind of more sustainable engagement in which we can meet some of the ecological and economical challenges here, as well as contributing to an overall development of agricultural areas, because most Africans still live in rural areas, is I think the major priority for the next 15, 20 years. And frankly, we need to do a lot more research, a lot more strategic thinking about how we can get that balance right.
What about the other side of the picture, returning to China, and given its energy race for African energy sources, how would China be placing itself to give back, as it were, to Africa?
Well, you're absolutely right to point out that African energy reserves are crucial to China. It's worth pointing out that, for example, China imports more oil today from Angola than it does from Saudi Arabia. It gives you a sense of the order of magnitude and the league in which certain African countries are now playing. Now, China has understood that merely taking these resources out is very quickly going to cause a major political backlash, just as there was a backlash against Western colonialism and against Western neocolonialism. So we see that on the Chinese side, there has been an attempt to invest a huge amount in African infrastructure, in things like bridges and dams and roads and railways. For the first time in many decades, African countries are building railways again, but also in prestige projects like new parliaments or new football stadiums. Now, that was in the first phase of the engagement, and by Chinese accounts, that only had limited success in the sense that many people felt that this infrastructural engagement was not enough. And therefore, we now see increased Chinese investment also in softer sectors like education and healthcare, traditional remits of Western NGOs and Western development cooperation. We see that there's increasing Chinese availability of scholarships, there's increasing funding going into research, into building up these African institutions, into providing hospitals with better healthcare, with better primary healthcare systems. And I think in many ways that this is exactly what Africans would like of it. In the first phase of its engagement, China has successfully changed the perception of Africa as an object of pity, as a passive agent that is merely there to have charity bestowed upon it, into an active economic agent. I think Africans now want to see that active economic relationship also has a social and ecological component in the next, again, 10, 15 years.
You are listening to Chai, Children of Adam and Eve on QF Radio 91.7 FM, a special dialogue program brought to you by Adil Khan, where we are discussing today all things related to Africa and the rest of the world with Professor Harry Verhoeven. Now that we have discussed Chinese and Middle Eastern relations with Africa, and we've completely missed out on the picture of, at the moment, what is often talked about, which is the European and American relationship with Africa, would you bring us closer to that conversation via the global climate change debate?
Sure. Well, climate change is, like in many other developing parts of the world, a huge challenge in Africa. And it's particularly a challenge for African countries. Because, first of all, it's, of course, not a problem they created. As we know, most carbon gas emissions happen in the United States, Canada, and in Europe. But secondly, because of the very particular and specific nature of what climate change is doing and will be doing in the future to Africa. And the central question here is the question of volatility, particularly of rainfall. The problem is not so much an increase or a decrease in aggregate rainfall. According to most climate models, on the African continent as a whole, overall aggregate levels of rainfall may well be constant. What's going to be particularly difficult is that rainfall is going to be ever more variable. That is to say, it will no longer be so much, it will be very concentrated in certain spaces and at certain moments throughout the year, not evenly spread, as is from an agricultural perspective the best way of receiving rainfall. Now, as I said earlier, agricultural development is a particular challenge in Africa. Most Africans live in the countryside, and productivity rates of African agriculture are much lower than elsewhere in the world. Climate change will make it even harder, because of the variability of rainfall today as well as in the future, to make sure that agricultural sector is developed. And it will have to be in the agricultural sector that most of the economic growth is realized, because we're already facing problems with rampant urbanization in the African context. Youth unemployment, people who are sitting around, lack of public services, crumbling infrastructure, etc. So it's absolutely crucial we focus on that rural sector. Now, here's where I think that there's an historic responsibility, particularly for North America and Europe, to try to help boost that transformation in African agriculture. Climate change was not of Africa's making, but they are in many ways on the receiving end of its worst consequences. And so what European and North American states really should be doing is help African agriculture successfully adapt to climate change. Climate change won't go away. It can perhaps be mitigated, but the adaptation debate is a debate we should have now. And therefore, it is important that North American and European countries don't just open their markets at a far greater scale than they so far have to African agricultural products, but that they also phase out a number of, frankly, very harmful subsidies that are given to European and North American producers. Most infamously in the sugar sector and in the cotton sector in North America, where there's a handful of farmers in the south of the US who receive huge amounts of money from the government to produce a commodity that is not competitive in international markets without the support. Now, the very fact that sugar and cotton is produced so much does erode the competitiveness of many ordinary small-scale African farmers who either want to scale up and become commercial farmers, or who merely want to survive and sell in their communities, but are faced with these cheaper goods from overseas that are cheap in an unfair way. So trying to change the trade debate and change the development debate will have a direct repercussion on how Africa experiences climate change, and up to what extent Africans will be resilient towards climate change. The alternative to that, of course, is that we do see economic growth in Africa, but it bypasses the vast majority of Africans. And of course, this is exactly the context in which problems like the migration crisis that we are already seeing all around the Mediterranean are getting worse and worse over time. So this is not just a matter of, as I said, charitable caring. If that argument is not enough for European and North American countries, and if the argument of historical responsibility is not enough, they should do it in their own self-interest. Because questions of security, questions of migration, and in the long run, questions of economic prosperity are very closely tied to how Africa, and particularly its rural areas, will be doing in the next 20 years.
This narrative seems to be an alternative to the narrative which one hears about Africa, which is the fair trade movement argument, that if conscientious buyers in Europe and America will, as it were, have care for African farmers, they will purchase coffee, for example, which is fair trade. But you're suggesting that the model needs to be rethought from the top down, which is the WTO and trade agreements and need to be rethought. But how is that ever going to happen without a lobbying structure for Africa and European and American countries?
It's a very good question. I am indeed critical of the fair trade movement, not because I think fair trade is a bad idea per se, but because when one really looks at the numbers, it is but a fraction. It is at best 1% in the most conscientious Western countries of the whole spectrum. In other words, if we're just going to rely this on change, even if it doubles, even if it triples, it is still not making the substantial difference we need. And this is why we need to go mainstream in terms of the trade and the finance debate. This is therefore extremely important. Now, when it comes to questions of international trade relations or international financial relations, you are indeed right that there is an incredible imbalance between the negotiating power of African countries and that of Western countries. But here is where the very fact that Africa now has multiple suitors, that there's no longer just the West in town, but there's China, there's India, there's Korea, there's also players like Turkey that are increasingly investing on the African continent and presence in a whole range of sectors. And that gives Africa options to build new diplomatic alliances, to work out new agreements or new arrangements that are more in its favor and play to its strength and its advantages. And the hope is that African countries will, of course, seize this historical opportunity. This opportunity may not continue to last. These countries may make arrangements amongst themselves rather than with Africa. That's all possible. All the more reason for African countries to come together, to work together through the African Union and other bodies, to speak for the 1 billion people living on the African continent, and to work pragmatically with whatever foreign partner is willing to work with it to improve its position in global trade and finance and development discussions, including climate change. That will be the only way it can get around this problem that you highlight.
So the big capital C doesn't usually, civilization doesn't really come into academic writings more recently. How do you use that category in your own analysis?
I use this category because it's a word that's actually very consciously used, particularly in the Sudanese question. In the Sudanese context. And so I in the title of my book, Water, Civilization and Power, civilization refers to the imagination of what development is and what political power is. Because in the book, I developed the hypothesis that one cannot understand the political history of Sudan, and particularly the extreme violence that has characterized so much of the history of the modern Sudanese state going back 200 years, unless and until one engages with the way water has been managed, and crucially, the way water has been instrumentalized by certain elites, both domestic Sudanese elites and external elites, for their own benefit. And a crucial part of this story are not just the material flows, the money or the actual water flowing, but also the imagination of what it means to develop. You're probably very familiar with these images of big dams on the Nile and big irrigation canals, and the idea that this is how you do development in this part of the world. The truth is that this was a choice. There is no natural law that dictates that this is the kind of model that Sudan or Egypt or Ethiopia should follow. This is a human choice. What the book tries to do is it tries to explain this choice and tries to explain who are the winners of these kind of choices and who the losers are. And very often the word civilization is given as the rationale by these different elites, saying, this is only very natural, this is how you do development in this part of the world, this is what civilization looks like. It's big dams, it's irrigation canals, it's centralized control over the river, taming the Nile. The book highlights that there are actually alternative strategies to deal with the many development problems that Sudan, Egypt, Ethiopia face, but that these historically have not been explored, not by academics and not by policymakers. And in that sense, we've actually contributed to keeping large swathes of the Sudanese, Egyptian, Ethiopian population impoverished and allowing certain people inside the country and outside the country to harvest disproportionate rents.
Opening the can of problems, which is the African intervention question. which is how does one intervene into Africa, whether coming from a European-American conversation or from a Chinese and Middle Eastern one, remains the same at some level, which is the big question about NGOs versus the state intervention. How do you place yourself in relation to that debate?
Well, I think, particularly on NGOs, I think in the last couple of years we've seen an increasing criticism coming from Africa and from African sources themselves regarding NGOs. The truth is that many NGOs, as in other parts of the developing world, have been taking over functions that should really be carried out by the state. Increasingly, we see NGOs providing healthcare, we see NGOs providing schooling, water and sanitation and other tasks that are really the core business of the state. And they've been doing this in parallel, in conjunction with the expansion of the private sector and the for-profit kind of enterprises in healthcare, in water provision, in electricity provision. What this ends up creating is that you have an elite who is well served by this kind of high-flying private sector, and on the other hand, an underclass that really gets the scraps of charity that, of course, are dependent on whether this year the NGO has as much money as it had last year to continue to sustain its operations. If the donors are not forthcoming, well, then the budget is not forthcoming, and therefore these people are excluded. I think what we are seeing in quite a few African contexts, and perhaps most strikingly in a country like Ethiopia, where historically NGOs and Western intervention have been very present, is a re-emergence and a reassertion of that state. And many citizens welcoming the re-emergence of that state, but also being more critical in the past of it, saying that unless and until the state provides these services in an accountable way, and in a way that money is not just siphoned off, or this is not just provided to the friends and pals of the local city councillor or the mayor or some minister, unless and until that happens, we're going to have a serious problem. And so in that sense, I'm seeing a re-emergence of the state in Africa, pushing back traditional donors up to some extent, welcoming new arrangement with outsiders, but more on an equal footing. And I think that this is a positive story. I think that this is the way forward, without being naive about the state. States do this for their own reasons, but that's exactly why you need an educated, aware citizenry to hold the state accountable, and to make sure that indeed these services are provided to everybody, or to as many people as they can, not just to the happy few as have been served in the past.
So the last question, and then we'll end our conversation, which is, do you look beyond the kind of violent image of Africa, which is often presented in social science and humanities literature?
I do. I happen to work mostly in East and Central Africa, which happen to be very violent places, and in many ways, it's much more violent places than actually people think in the media and in academia, in the sense that the daily reality for many people is an extremely violent reality. It's a reality of daily impingement on their rights. This being said, I don't necessarily at all see Africa as a hopelessly violent, anarchical place. There is a logic to a lot of the violence, as there has been a logic to violence in Europe, as there has been a logic to violence in Asia. There are many swathes of parts of the continent that are not particularly violent, in the sense that the state does not necessarily commit large-scale massacres or infringements on people's rights. There are many places where there are no rebellions, where there haven't been coups d'etats in a very long time, and that deserves to be highlighted too. I think increasingly what you're seeing in different parts of the continent are very diverse trajectories. Some countries are clearly doing very well, have been seeing multiple democratic elections, have seen steady economic growth, have seen a strengthening of civil society, showing incredible economic dynamism. Other places are not. So yes, in many ways it is important to step away from this monodimensional image of Africa as just this or just that. It's not useful to think of Africa as an entirely violent place. It's not useful to think of Africa as a place devoid of violence. The truth is that in many places these things can coexist or can change over time. And I think if we can come to this kind of more nuanced, holistic picture, that's a more useful takeaway for both academics and media professionals.
And just unfortunately, we're running out of time, but otherwise we would have some time to talk about the Ebola image, which is now equated with Africa. But if you'd have a last word on that, and then we'll...
Oh, unfortunately, Ebola is only really present in 3 African countries. It's present in Guinea, in Sierra Leone, and Liberia. These are 3 countries out of a total of 55 countries. The number of people living there is perhaps 1% of the total African population. It's very unfortunate that the continent's once again being associated with this. While, other countries where other very terrible diseases are very prevalent are not at all associated with this. Very few people, when I say China, immediately think of flu, even though most of flu cases are in China, or TB in India. Unfortunately, in this case, this is always associated.
Thank you very much for your time today, Professor Harry, and Ramadan Kareem to our listeners. And if you'd have a wish for Ramadan as well for our
Ramadan Mubarak to all listeners too.
Thank you very much, and stay tuned for our next program. And a special thanks to Ehab Al-Sheikh for bringing this program to you. Goodbye for now.